Everyone. We will get started here at 1 o'clock. Thank you for joining today's Sterling webinar, Should Your Matting Plan Include Intermediate Moves? I'm Brent Sedlacek, the Director of Channel Development at Sterling, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's format will include an interactive presentation that includes a few polling questions and finishes up with a Q&A session. As you think of questions throughout the meeting, please type those questions into the questions tab on your screen. We will collect those and answer the questions at the end of the presentation, as well as send out an email response to each of those questions. We also have a few polling questions, and we look forward to your responses to those. Immediately following the webinar, we will ask that you take a 2 to 3 minute survey to give us feedback on this content and future content, and also to enter into a drawing for a gift card. A recording of today's webinar will be sent following the call, as well as a certificate of completion for those that attend the entire call. Thanks again for joining today. Our presenter today is John Capodice, our Executive Vice President of Sales. John joined Sterling more than 9 years ago and brings 30 years of expertise in construction and job site access solutions. John has played a crucial role in building Sterling's site access business, as well as starting up our environmental construction services division. John has forged long-term partnerships with some of the largest utilities in the U.S. And is actively calling on many customers today. I will now turn the presentation over to John.
Thank you, Brent, for the introduction. Much appreciation. And thank you to all of the attendees for taking the time out of your busy schedules today to join us in this webinar. The agenda today is going to be pretty quick. We'll discuss our first safety moment, and then we'll get into the intermediate move criteria. We'll look at some case studies. Then we'll jump into the Q&A, and then Brent's going to jump back on and talk to you about the additional resources. Safety moment, distracted driving is the moment for today. And obviously, cell phone applications are quite hazardous to our health when it comes to getting behind the wheel. A couple different types of distractions are obviously the visuals that you can see there listed, some of the things that might distract you visually. And then, of course, manually, picking up that coffee from Starbucks or eating that hamburger for lunch in the afternoon. And then the cognitive side of that. If we look at that chart on the right-hand side, you can see that driving is obviously an extremely low distraction because you're focused on driving and that's all that you should be doing. But as you move your way to the right and up that chart, those bar graphs start to indicate how the distractions become more medium and more high, or much higher of a distraction. So adjusting the radio or the temperature, of course, listening and composing messages on your cell phone is not good to do. And then the worst thing we could do on the right-hand side is navigating complex menus. So I would consider that to be my GPS on my cell phone, trying to get to where I need to be when I need to be there. Is never good while you're driving. It is the highest distraction. So I want to tell you a quick story that I experienced personally. And I got to tell you, it was all part of the cognitive type activities. And it was a personal story based around a near-death situation that I put myself into harm's way, as I was a victim of attempted carjacking. I became a victim because I was on a very intense cell phone call with one of my coworkers, and it was supposed to be heading northbound on the expressway and ended up exiting southbound, which would have been towards home. And upon realizing I was heading south and not north to get to a meeting, I quickly exited the first ramp that I could, stopped at a stoplight, and there was an assailant approaching my vehicle with a gun in hand, trying to carjack my vehicle or any vehicle that he can get his hands wrapped around. And when he approached my door, I made a split-second decision to turn the car to the left and blow through a construction zone to get out of harm's way. And luckily, I was able to do so without harm. But that story did end up on the 10 o'clock news that evening, and it was pretty earth-shattering when that happened, obviously. So because I was in that cognitive state, it was quite disturbing, and I would encourage you all, because I certainly do rethink my intense conversations on the cell phone while I'm driving. So please put the phone down, pull over on the side of the road, turn on your hazards, and answer the call if you have to answer it, and or text the message if you have to do so at that time. So I share that moment with you, and we'll go ahead and continue to move forward. All right, optimizing site access solutions. Safety, efficiency, and cost are always priority number one. Intermediate moves versus fully matting a work site are things that need to be considered, and there's several factors that are going to be involved in making that decision. Brent's going to go ahead and hit us with poll question number one. Brent, if you could take that.
Fantastic. So a quick polling question here. We'd like to get your feedback on what % of your matting projects include intermediate moves. You should be able to vote here. I'll give you a minute to do so. Great, and we will close the poll. So based on your feedback, those that are including matting moves less than 25% of the time is 31%, and our majority of 35% of attendees here today use intermediate moves 51 to 75% of the time. So thank you for your feedback on that. John, I think you have control.
Not yet. There it goes. There it goes. All right, thank you for that poll question, Brent. Very interesting to see it. 35% fall into that category of intermediate moves are quite common for them. So thank you for that poll. Top considerations that we need to look at when we're talking about intermediate moves are the ones that impact the project the most. In understanding the project scale, the schedule, the geography, the environmental, the scope of work, the contractor's network, the equipment, and of course the ultimate decision maker is the budget. We're going to hit on all 8 of these top considerations. And the first one we want to talk about here is intermediate moves and what does entail in a quick snapshot of what an intermediate move would look like. So we look at whether or not there's a long project duration that is part of our consideration. Is the mileage long in mileage? Is it a 15-mile line or is it a 30-mile line that we need to obviously redesign what we were thinking when we attempt to mat? And is it a sequenced outage schedule, ensuring that we can move down the right of way in sequence as opposed to hopscotching around? And then a well-defined segment breakdown is also a major consideration. If you're looking at fully matting and what are the details of a fully matted opportunity, it's always, and normally it is, the short project duration, 30, 60, maybe 90 days, where you just might mat the entire right of way. A compressed outage schedule would also allow for that possibly to be the option, is to fully mat. And of course, emergent work. There's no delaying getting onto a job site as you need to get the power back on as soon as possible. So it is quite very much so the opportunity to fully mat the project in order to get the lights on sooner than later. And then simultaneous work in different segments. So if there's that scenario where the drilling contractor cannot complete segment 1 due to some real estate issues, it's quite possible he will be moving into segment 2 or 3, and or maybe it's just been scheduled that he would be working and starting out in segment 1, 2, and 3. And the hopscotching would obviously prevent an intermediate move scenario. So that's when a fully matting situation could occur. So when we look at the projects themselves and what's really, as we discussed, top 8 bullet points, project scale is obviously our first priority. Understanding what the mileage is it short or long in distance? And what is the line size? Is it 69 kV or 345 kV, which could be an added factor in determining an intermediate move based on what type of mats you're putting down to handle the size equipment that's coming onto the site. The schedule itself is also critically important. What is the schedule? If it's a reconductoring or there's work being done and there's an outage that has been authorized, we want to make sure that we're falling within that authorized outage schedule, and we do not want to surpass that, of course. So what we try to do is understand that the outage schedule will dictate whether or not an intermediate move can or cannot be accomplished. Or is it a new line that's going into service, and what is the in-service date? We always know what the deadline is, but if everything is coordinated properly through an intermediate move situation, it is quite possible that we can come in under budget and under time by being able to understand what the in-service date is and plan accordingly to do just that. And then, of course, the duration of the project. Understanding what is the duration. Is it a long duration or is it a shorter duration? That will play a critical role in understanding whether or not an intermediate move is an option. And then available access. Is there any questions that have been asked in regards to ensuring that the real estate departments within the utility company have been able to manage the real estate acquiring, and if whether or not there's any eminent domain scenarios that need to be addressed in ensuring that available access sequencing down the right of way is in place. And then, of course, the geography. What area of the country are you working in? Are you working in the Northeast? Are you working in the Southeast? Are you working down in the South or the Midwest or in the Northeast or the Southeast? All of those geographies could present their own challenges when it comes to making a decision on whether or not an intermediate move is the right thing to do. And then you have to consider the topography. And when you're looking at topography, obviously you're going to judge yourself on whether or not your elevation changes might require some challenges or some risk when talking about intermediate moves. And then also, what are the soil and ground conditions? Is it wet? Is it soft? Are there things that you need to be aware of in regards to the soil? Is it permafrost, which could be an option, or is it a coastal tidal area sitting out there on the east or west coast? Those are certainly things that need to be considered. And then again, with the topography, looking at whether or not you have peat moss or wet conditions or a wetland area, stumps, large rocks, or boulders, and ruts and gaps that could also be things that need to be considered when moving mats down the right of way, because certainly if you're doing that, these could be obstacles and they could be challenging to navigate around. And we want to make sure that we're identifying them very carefully. On the environmental side, you can see that wetlands and wetland delineation is obviously number one on the wetland side. Making sure you understand what the permits are and the permit conditions is critical to that. There's a scenario that's come into play several times for us when we have understood the permit conditions to be that you cannot mat the wetland without having new mats. They have to be clean, they have to be new, because they are worried about contamination and cross-contamination. Of course, we're not as concerned about that with our Terralam matting product because it is a solid, flat, smooth surface. But there are permit conditions that might say that if that mat's not used, you cannot bring it into the wetland area. So when you're determining your intermediate moves, you have to really consider whether or not the mats you have in the right-of-way can be moved down the right-of-way without having to replace them into a new quality type product. Other considerations would be endangered species and invasive species. As we all know, sometimes the permits will allow you to only go in there and disturb the environment once and not necessarily have the opportunity to go back there and remat if required. So we want to make sure that we understand what those conditions are and plan our intermediate moves according to what the permits are going to allow us to do. And of course, I would apply the same for invasive species as well. Then of course, you do have to consider your seasonal climate and your weather changes that could also occur. And then we have to look at what is the scope of work. Is it a reconductoring of an existing line, or is it a reconductoring of an existing line with potentially replacing certain towers? Maybe not all of them, but certain towers might need to be replaced. So in that case, you would have to consider the fact that there's going to be new foundations that are going to have to be drilled. There's going to have to be new towers erected in order to complete that reconductoring? Or is it a new line, and having the ability to get into the new line after the clearing has been accomplished and everything's been opened up, knowing that you're also going to have foundations being drilled and new towers being erected. So understanding the scope of work and what's going to be occurring on site can certainly affect your intermediate moves. Some other factors to consider would be excavating, obviously gravel roads, which could be part of that. If they so choose to try to run on grade through an excavating scenario or through a gravel road scenario, it's certainly a possibility. And again, that will affect your intermediate move plan. And then identifying all the crossings that are occurring within the right-of-way, whether it be a ditch crossing or a creek crossing, or even a stream crossing or a river crossing, could be a pipeline crossing, could be a stormwater drainage system scenario, or it could also be a utility vault. We have to be aware of what is going on underneath the point load of the equipment traveling down. So again, intermediate moves have to be clearly identified, and those key factors have to be spelled out so that we don't put anybody in harm's way by matting over and or around something that could have been done a little bit differently or with safer, more efficient means. And then the lay down yards. Understanding in that scenario, what is the size of the equipment and things that are coming in to ensure that we have everything covered for a lay down yard. I assume there's going to be an office in some cases built onto that lay down yard, like a trailer, supplies that are going to be utilized on the project up and down the right of way. And then, of course, accommodations for the workers that are on site, whether it be eating accommodations or a muster area in case of emergency. We want to make sure we understand all of that because that will certainly play an effect as well, and making sure we have the right matting plan in place to accommodate those scenarios. In the picture, you can see the elevated platform that was built on the bottom right-hand side of that screen. You can also see that we're working on both sides of a very busy highway. You can identify lane closures. So when you talk about intermediate moves and at some point in time finishing up the work that you see in this picture and deciding whether or not these mats are going to be moved down the right of way, there may be a need to not, based on the type of volume that you're looking at in the elevated platform with the mats that are sitting in that picture. So you may have to make your considerations on eliminating some of the matting and sending it back off rent and taking it off rent for the utility company or the customer to ensure that you're doing the right thing in maintaining your plan as it was designed for the intermediate move scenario. And then, of course, the contractor network is really critical, particularly when managing intermediate moves for the sake of efficiency. So being able to build your contractor network in communication with your drilling contractors to understand what their plan is, to understand whether or not they're bringing in one machine to work sequentially down the line, or if they're bringing in multiple machines to work on the first segment, they're going to move all those multiple machines off to the second segment and drill multiple foundations in a day. Or is the plan, as I mentioned earlier, to start in segment 1, maybe move to segment 2 as well and start there, segment 3, and kind of split it up. So understanding the contractors that are going to be on site and understanding what their schedule is critically important. Same thing would apply to the line contractors. Is it their intention to pull 3 miles at a time or to pull 5 miles at a time? You're going to need to know that when planning your intermediate moves because that will be a major effect on where those mats should be placed and at the timing they should be placed. Usually those decisions are made with 45-degree and 90-degree turns. And so that communication with those two are critical, but there's other people on site as well that play a critical role. And that would be your crane companies that might have to do some of your tower lifts, particularly in a tower raising situation where you're doing tower raises, communicating with the crane company on what their schedule looks like and how fast they're going to be able to move down the right of way. Then, of course, you've got your civil contractors, your surveyors, and your environmental firms that also need to be considered. So you could have anywhere from 2 or 3, upwards of possibly even 8 to 10 different contractors on site. And it's the access provider's goal and journey to figure out what everybody's needs are to ensure that we're laying the mats down once, getting all the work accomplished in a timely manner so that everything down the right of way flows safely and efficiently. I apologize for the technical difficulty here. There it goes. And then when you consider intermediate moves, you have to consider the equipment size and the weight and the volume of the equipment that's going to be on site. In this picture, you can see there's quite a bit of equipment concentrated in a very dense area. So again, you have to understand how much volume of equipment is going to be on site. So when you're designing your platforms and you're understanding what your needs are for your laydown yards, you're designing them properly. And as of course you move down the right of way, you get near a completion. So all those mats don't necessarily need to be moved down the right of way because things are starting to slow down. They're starting to soften up a little bit in regards to the volume of traffic. So obviously that's very critical to understand and be able to plan your intermediate moves with potentially taking mats off rents to help with that budget and come in under budget. And then of course the weight of the equipment is critical as well, because that's going to be dependent upon what type of a mat you actually put down. And in doing so, is that mat going to be a heavy enough mat to manage the drilling rig, but do you really need that mat being that heavy to work with the line contractors who don't require such a heavy mat? So it makes a big deal in regards to the freight cost in moving down the right of way and having to deal with that scenario because you may not need the heavier mat for the whole project. So designing and planning your intermediate moves should consider what type of matting you're going to need to move and try to save that cost on that freight moving it down the right of way, as opposed to a wheel loader picking it up and moving it down the right of way versus a semi-trailer that has to be loaded out and driven down the roadway 2 or 3 miles to get to the next access point. So those are key considerations. And of course, rubber tired and steel and or rubber tracked equipment could play a critical role on minimizing the amount of attrition that could occur if you're dealing with steel tracked equipment versus rubber tracked equipment. So again, considerations on the type of mat that needs to be addressed through the intermediate move process in analyzing the equipment. And then the last slide here is on the budget. Was this a pre-planned CapEx spend situation that was planned for in the previous year, and the budget's already been set and you know what you're working with in regards to that, and the goal of course would be to come in under budget with the right plan, and that's what we're really good at doing? Or is it part of a maintenance budget that the utility company has, and there's some maintenance that need to be done on a particular project? Or in the case of the picture where a fully matted situation occurred, is it emergent work? And that's exactly what has occurred in this particular picture here. And the other factors that could be involved with obviously affecting the budget is whether or not it's a rental or a lease or a purchase. And if you can understand what that looks like, obviously you're putting yourself in a much better position to create the right plan. And then of course, what are the market conditions? What does the supply chain look like? In some cases, particularly with wood these days and the demand on the housing market that we are experiencing today, of course, the market conditions have not been favorable for those that are in the wood mat business in regards to getting lumber at the right price and, of course, getting enough supply chain distribution points together to be able to supply the demand in the marketplace. So all of these things need to be considered when you start looking at the budget and ensuring that you've got your labor and your freight also properly organized. Because if you're in a freight situation where the lanes are only going in one direction and there's no 2-lane options for the freight companies and the brokers that are handling your freight, you have to be aware of that, because if it's a 1-lane situation, you're probably going to get hit with much higher freight fees coming in because they're not going to be able to pull loads back out again. So other major things that need to be considered throughout the process of setting up your intermediate moves and ensuring that you're doing it with the right numbers in tackling all of those obstacles and risks that could apply with that plan.
Thanks, John.
Hey, Brent. You bet.
At this point, we're going to go into our second polling question. And this polling question is, for your upcoming projects, how do you plan to assess your use of intermediate moves? Go ahead and give you a minute here to respond to that. Great. Give you one more second here and we'll close the poll. And so based on your feedback, it looks like 58% of our attendees today are going to be using their internal team to assess that. So it sounds like a really good capability of our attendees today on the ability to work on this internally and come up with a plan. With that, John, we will go back over and talk about two different case studies of examples of moves.
Yep, thank you, Brent. And of course, in South Central U.S., we had a transmission line rebuild that included the scope of work of drilling, pole installations, and line poles. We had one prime and two subs on this particular job. It was a single lane right-of-way. The platforms that were built around the structures were 80 by 80 in size. We had less than 10 creek crossings, 25 to 50 low water areas. We had some clearing that was done and some erosion controls that had to be created. The project scale was a 345 kV, 180-day duration, 96 structures, approximately 900 foot of span per span, 24 access points, and 140,000 lineal feet of matting with 6 90-degree turns. And some of the external factors that we're working with, January through July, so 2 different seasons, non-union labor, conservation area, and 1 highway crossing. When we looked at the plan itself, we started to say, how can we break this down? So we broke it into 6 different segments with 5 intermediate moves. Obviously, they're identified in that picture on the right by color. And when we looked at the project plan, creating those 5 moves, we looked at a total mat rental of 3,000 mats with a total of mat touches of 15,000, which really means that if you were going to mat this entire thing, it probably could have been done with 15,000 mats. So literally saving 12,000 mats being on rent turned into a savings of roughly $5.4 million. So this just gives you an example of a scenario where an intermediate move was certainly the right thing to do in this application, and the dollars that were saved by doing so with the proper timing and the proper planning and the proper breakdown, we were able to perform and save $5.4 million on this particular project. The next project was a little bit kind of similar, a little bit smaller in scale though. The scope of work was drilling pier and foundation poles, install line poles, 1 prime and 6 subs. Again, working on that contractor network and identifying those 6 subs and communicating properly. A single lane right away, 10 culverts, 10 airbridge crossings. Of course, weekly maintenance was required. The scale of this project was 138 kV, 2 circuits, 6 months roughly in duration, 25 miles long, 3 90-degree turns, and 3 45-degree turns. Again, two-season exposure, arid climate with flooding was certainly going to be an option, and then non-union labor, and then 2 highway crossings. We identified what this plan was going to look like on this 25-mile line. You could see the blue in the first segment there turned out to be 16 miles, 4 miles in the yellow, 5 miles in the orange. And with that being said, we were able to fully mat the first segment with 2,200 mats, and then moving down the right of way on those intermediate move scenarios, the yellow segment, we put in 600 of those 2,200 mats. The orange segment, we put in 850 of those mats, and then we took 750 mats off the site. So this was roughly a $1.9 million project where we were able to provide the services that we did, pull some mats off rent, and avoid what could have been 3 to 4 times the actual cost of the 1.9 million is what it would have been to look at it a little bit differently and do the things that could have been done differently in regards to fully matting the situation. So we share these 2 examples with you as real life projects that have occurred and how we managed to be able to pull it off and keep both of these projects within budget or under budget at any given time. So those were the 2 projects that we had working for us. And then we created this little chart for you, which you're going to receive, consistency in evaluating the projects. So we look at all of those things we just discussed. We looked at the applications, the contractors, the budget, the environmental scope of work, project scale, schedule, pull plan, equipment, and geography. And we create a bunch of check boxes surrounding what are the things that we look at as an organization to ensure we're identifying what's critically important when considering an intermediate move and what is the right matting plan to do so. So we put this together for you for that reason, and I hope that it proves to be of some value to you and your future needs.
Thank you, John. We are now going to go over into a Q&A session. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type those into the question box, and we will go ahead and answer as many of those questions as we can. John, let me go and start off with a few of these. When leapfrogging mats and you enter a low ground, high water level situation, how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously, pre-planning and understanding what the elevations are going to look like is certainly going to be an option for us to try to dial in on whether or not we're going to have to possibly double mat the right of way and or bring in a connecting system to ensure that we don't have a floating situation occurring as those mats may be lifted off of the right of way. So based on the fact that we have a couple different scenarios that could come into play with it, adding additional mats and or connecting those mats that exist on the right of way, it's really dependent upon how high and what we think the water level may be and whether or not there's any real force to that water level. Is it next to a river crossing where you have a consistent moving, or is it more of a very stable ponding type effect? So we would take all of those things into consideration when creating the right access plan for that situation, Brent.
Okay, thanks. The next question, does Sterling charge a consulting fee to assess moves?
Another good question. So Sterling does not charge a consulting fee. We feel that as an access supplier, we have an obligation to provide you with the service that's required. And the hope is, of course, by doing so without fee, we hope that you would bring us in early enough to the stage of the project so that we'd be able to provide you with the best access plan, which would include getting eyes on site, going out there and walking down the project to ensure that we've identified any of the risks that can visually be seen as boots on the ground, as opposed to doing a flyover or working off of a KMZ file. It's always best to get boots on the ground and take a look at what really exists. It could mean that we're going to traverse it with a four-wheeler, and or we have flown right-of-ways as well in the past on very large right-of-ways. We've gotten helicopters and flown them to get visual on the project itself. So there is no consulting fees that Sterling would charge for our vendors that we want to be partners with, and that's how we work it. So we'd be happy to engage any of our customers on that level and make sure that we're getting in early enough to make the right decisions on what the best access plan would be.
Okay. Question back to our polling question one: how often does Sterling move mats on the projects they work on?
Yeah, that's a great question. We find that, being a full access distributor, that the matting that we supply is for both a distribution and overhead transmission. And I can honestly tell you that it appears that the majority of the overhead transmission line work that we do, so over 50% of it would be an intermediate move situation. And the distribution side is obviously not always the case. Generally, it's just darting in and off of the roadway to get into a wooden pole situation for distribution. But certainly on the overhead transmission side is where it really comes into play most commonly. But there are some larger 69 kV type projects or 118 that would require us doing an intermediate move on a smaller scale as well.
Okay. Are there any parts of the country where you tend to mat full projects more often?
I guess, that's a really tricky question there as well, but I would tell you this. I would think that in the eastern portion of the country, where you're dealing with a lot of wetlands and a lot of wet area down the right-of-ways where some of these lines exist, that you might be more prone to matting more and fully as opposed to doing intermediate moves because of those wetland conditions. But it's a pretty difficult question to answer, Brent, with all due respect to the person asking the question. We do the intermediate moves as we feel that they are required to be done, and it really, I can't really identify one market more than the other than the Southeast, where you've got a lot of those wetland areas that you're dealing with down in Florida.
Great. Next question, is there a difference in intermediate moves depending on what style of mat you are using? Wood mats, timber mats, plastic mats?
Yeah, there certainly is. When you're looking at your budget for the project itself and you're talking about what are your expenses going to be to move those mats down the right of way, you really have to take into consideration the key factors in regards to a plastic scenario, right? So plastic, you're going to have to do a connecting system. Usually it takes 2 to 3 men on the ground, boots on the ground, to be able to do that with an operator and a machinery moving the mats around for you. And when you talk about intermediate moves, the expense of moving plastic under those conditions, because when you put them in, you have to do the install of the bolt itself. But when you take them out, you also have to deal with that as well. And then you have to move them down the right of way, go through the same installation and removal process again. And you could be doing that 5 or 6 times. So that creates a challenge in regards to moving those particular mats down the right of way. But when you talk about wood scenarios, yes, there is a wood connecting system, but it's not requiring boots on the ground while the matting is being laid. So it's much safer to lay wood mats down and connect them while all the equipment is parked and not putting anybody in harm's way or in the line of fire by working around that equipment. So the cost is far less to move wood mats down the right of way for an intermediate move than it would be to use plastic. But Sterling is non-biased. We use plastic in many applications where it does make sense that plastic is the right mat, but we are also very considerate to the cost, and wood is sometimes the best option based on the costing scenario, as I just described it to be. Great question.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you all for your questions today. We do have 3 upcoming webinars in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about early phase planning and budgeting for site access and when you should start thinking about your site access plans. In March, we have 2 webinars. First on bridging the gap, choosing the right bridge for projects, whether that's air bridging or full bridging. And last, on March 24th, we will be talking about key matting and platform considerations before big lifts. Please feel free to find registration from our website, and you'll also be receiving follow-up emails with invitations to join those events. We have several online resources at sterlingsolutions.com. There are a number of case studies, white papers, and videos that you can download. Following today's call, you will be receiving a recording of today's event. You'll be receiving a certificate of attendance, and we will be posting out responses to today's Q&A questions. As you close out on your web browser, you will be prompted to take a survey about today's event. If your company allows, you are welcome to opt in to be entered into a raffle for an Amazon gift card. Thank you again for attending today. We appreciate your time. And John, thank you for your expertise on talking through the use of intermediate moves in site access.
Thank you, Brent, and thank you to the attendees for participating today. It's much appreciated.
Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you in our future webinars.